We're here, we're queer, and we love the Lord. That's right, you're listening to Coming Out Christian, a podcast about life at the intersection of queer identity and Christian faith. This fun, faithful, and sometimes irreverent podcast is a production of Love Boldly, an Ohio-based nonprofit creating spaces where LGBTQIA+ people can flourish in Christianity. I'm one of your hosts, Siobhan Boyd Nelson, and my co-host is the Reverend Dr. Ben Hillscamp, Executive Director of Love Boldly. So join us, and let's find out who's coming out today. Hello there, Ben. How are you?
Doing well, Siobhan. How are you?
Doing okay. You know, this episode will be coming out, I think, June 29th. So it's going to be the end of a long, long Pride Month, as always. But again, I'll say I will be so wrapped in love from all the amazing hugs from my community that I will have gotten all month long. So I can't complain.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious to see what this point in Pride Month is going to look like for me. My Pride Month right now is front-loaded. So
Okay.
I will, at this point, I'm not sure if I'm attending Pride festivals, if what exactly I'm working on at this point at the end of Pride Month, because everything I have planned everything I've planned organizationally, church-wise, is all in the first half of Pride Month. So I'll be really curious to see where I am at this point.
Yeah, I think that might be a smart move on your part. Spend the second half of June resting and actually celebrating Pride by resting. That'll be fun to see. All right, Ben, I've got a question for you before we meet our guest, and we have an amazing guest this episode. And I think our guest has seen the show that I want to ask you about, Ben. But there's this new show on Hulu. It's called Mid-Century Modern. Have you seen it?
I have.
Yeah. So I like to describe it as the Golden Girls, but with middle-aged gay guys. Would you say that that's a pretty accurate way of describing it?
Yeah, totally. I would be very surprised if the writers hadn't had that in mind when they wrote the show.
Right. Except that, and it's West Coast, not Florida, but Palm Springs. So some West Coast feels on the Golden Girls vibe. Now, one of the episodes my wife and I watched recently was episode 5, Hello Fisties. Have you seen that one yet?
I have not.
Okay. It was such a coming out Christian episode. I cannot wait for you to watch it because, and I'm taking this from the wiki, so I wanted to make sure I didn't do any spoilers. So this is from the wiki description to make sure of that. One of the main characters, Jerry, is an ex-Mormon, right? And that is a pretty big part of his character and his character development so far in the show. And the guys return to Fire Island. If you know, you know. I don't know. Let me be very clear. I don't know. I've only heard. Okay. But the guys return to Fire Island, and Jerry meets another gay closeted Mormon. And I loved this episode. My wife and I both loved this episode. And I think what we loved about it is that at the end of the episode, I was left with the feeling that, wow, this shit's complicated. How did you feel at the end of that episode, Ben?
Well, again, I haven't seen that episode.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So, but that made me feel good because this shit is complicated. So I was happy to see that they didn't try to resolve this issue in any one way.
Yeah, and I appreciate shows, comedy, drama, whatever, that do speak to how complicated these things can be. In the episodes of Mid-Century Modern that I've seen, even the relationship between the one character and his mother, and how complicated, partially religious, partially not, partially, there's a lot of undercurrents there. That you typically don't see presented in a lot of shows. Another show that comes to mind for that is Modern Family.
Right.
And one of the things I loved in that show was both how they, the supposedly more feminine of the two queer men is also the one who played football and grew up on a farm, and they really
Yes,
played around with gender and gender norms. They also did a great episode, or maybe episodes, where those two queer white men have to wrestle with the fact that they're raising an Asian American child, and what
that's
that
right.
means.
Yeah,
Um, I remember the episode where she says, I'm gay. And she's not actually saying I'm gay, but she's adapted, the culture that she's living in is this gay male culture, and she's taken it on for herself. Um,
right.
and I mean, though, some of those types of struggles, and yes, they play nicely with it. They don't make fun of it, but they play
Hmm.
nicely with it. They expose some of the absurdity there, but
Yeah.
they still treat it with real respect for, yeah, this is complicated. It's not always funny. Sometimes it is. So
Hmm.
no, I appreciate that. I have to watch that. I definitely have to check out that episode. But um, yeah, I really appreciate that complexity.
Me too. Well, let's see if our guest today has seen that episode and has any thoughts about it. Our amazing guest today is Brandan Robertson, who we are so happy to have here. Brandan, who uses he, him pronouns, is a reverend and is a noted author, pastor, and public theologian at the forefront of the progressive faith movement. He is the author of 10 books, including the bestseller True Inclusion, Creating Communities of Radical Embrace, and hosts the Brandan Robertson Show, where he engages leading voices in conversations on spirituality, social renewal, and the journey toward wholeness. Affectionately known as the TikTok Pastor, his inclusive theological content reaches over 300,000 followers online. Beyond the digital pulpit, he speaks across the country on spirituality, justice, and LGBTQ plus inclusion. He currently serves as pastor of Sunnyside Reformed Church in New York City and is pursuing a PhD in New Testament at Drew University. Welcome, 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 Reverend Brandan. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, it's so good to be with you all. I love this podcast. I love the work of Love Boldly, and I'm super excited for this conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Now, before we get into our real first question for you, have you seen Mid-Century Modern? Have you seen episode 5, Hello Fisties?
So I actually have not seen Mid-Century Modern. I know about it because one of the actors, Nathan Lee Graham, we connected on Instagram because he does have from what I understand, a gay Christian coming out story. And so I was super excited to see this new project and to know that there is a gay Christian being able to represent on the public stage.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I'm going to recommend that everyone give that episode a watch, even if you only watch that episode. These type of laugh track comedies aren't for everyone. I get that, but it's just you're left with, wow, this shit's complicated, and I really appreciate that visibility that we're not a monolith and we can't address these very complicated issues in a single way, which is why we're so happy to have your voice today, Brandan, and to hear your story. So our first question for all of our guests is, what is your testimony? What is your story at the intersection of queer identity and Christian faith?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a complicated journey, like it is for all of us. I didn't grow up Christian, and I did recognize at an early age, or rather, I'll say other people recognized that I was gay before I knew it. But when I had a conversion experience at the age of 12 in a fundamentalist Baptist church, um, pretty soon after that moment, I kind of entered into puberty and began recognizing that I was different. And my church was very clear that homosexuality was a sin and that there was no room for this in the church or in God's love. And so I repressed my sexuality like so many of us did and went off to Moody Bible Institute, a conservative evangelical school, to study to be a conservative pastor. And in my head and heart, I believed that by going to Moody, by dedicating my life to be a pastor, that God would certainly take away my same sex attraction. God would make me straight. God would give me a wife, and I would graduate and go live a straight Christian life. But really, everything changed for me in those 4 years in Chicago at Moody because two things happened. One, every time we'd leave campus, I would go out into the city of Chicago, and it was the first big city I'd lived in. And I would find God in all the places my theology said God wasn't supposed to be. And that included finding God in progressive churches and finding Christ like people in the gay neighborhood of Chicago. And that started causing this cognitive dissonance of how could these people have what looked like the love and light of God in them if they're abominations and unchristian and we're not a part of God's work in the world. And I also started getting mentored by an ex-gay professor at Moody who really tried to help me uh, not reconcile faith and sexuality, but recognize that I could be a Christian with this struggle, but that I would need to spend my life as a celibate person wrestling with and seeking healing from my same sex attraction. And that all came to a culmination my senior year when I did a year of conversion therapy at my school, in kind of a last ditch effort to try to get healed so that I could continue on this calling that I sensed that I had to be an evangelical pastor. But of course, that didn't work. And by the time I got to the end of my time at Moody and had tried conversion therapy and had done my best to reconcile my theology, I recognized that God didn't want to heal me. My theological studies showed me that the Bible was at least more complicated on these topics than my church told me it was, if not silent on the topic of LGBT people. And that put me in this trajectory when I graduated to essentially find progressive, inclusive Christian churches. And I began exploring my faith and my sense of calling as an openly gay person. And it became this incredibly healing experience. The last thing I'll say is, progressive Christians, I only knew that they existed because the evangelicals talked about some of the big heretics like Rob Bell or Brian McLaren back in the day. Those were the folks that people were talking about. But I really didn't know that there were large denominations that were fully inclusive of LGBT people until after I graduated Moody and found myself in DC and recognized that most Protestant seminaries were inclusive and that so many of these churches were inclusive. And that really gave me the secondary mission that I have, which is to help folks know that progressive Christians exist, that inclusive Christians exist in the world. And so I've spent the past decade doing that work, both for the queer community and the broader community.
That's an amazing story. And so I guess one of my questions is, when you're at Moody, I'm imagining, especially coming from probably a small town, and then going to Chicago, I'm guessing that Moody was a community for you and that you had built community there. But then once you left Moody and went to DC, do you still have that community, or was it a matter of finding new community that more aligned with the way that you saw the world and the way that you began to interpret the Bible?
That's such a great question because I think that is a common experience for so many queer people of faith. You're exactly right. Over my 4 years at Moody, I was threatened with expulsion 6 times, not because I was doing anything fun like drinking or sex or anything like that. It was because I was asking questions about theology that Moody didn't align with, and I was questioning teachings about sexuality. And every time I was brought into the dean's office and said, "You might be expelled if you don't align with our theology," what pained me was not that I would get expelled from the school. I knew I could go to a different school. What pained me was that I had built this community of people that I felt like I was a part of, that as a 12-year-old saved my life in many ways because I grew up in an alcoholic and abusive family. And so the church became this place that provided security and the first place I felt accepted as a kid. And so every time I was threatened with, "You might not belong here." And not only that, but not only will you not belong here, if you don't align with us, you're going to go to hell. God doesn't actually love you. That caused such anxiety and angst in me, and that kept me in the closet longer than I desired to be. But the good news is, after I did come out, what I found was that, one, a progressive, inclusive Christian community does exist out in the world, and I did find that in DC, but also the queer community at large, not just the Christian community, but my queer siblings that I began to experience and explore my new life with in DC became like a church to me. And I actually say all the time that I find more spiritual sustenance, even today as a pastor, in a queer bar on a Friday night with my friends where we get to just be ourselves and show up without any pretense than I do in most religious spaces where even in progressive spaces, we still perform a little bit. And there's still a little bit of playing by rules. And so, yeah, I found great new community, both in the LGBT community and in progressive Christianity.
I just want to say quickly that that is becoming a theme. That is quickly becoming a theme that we've heard more than one person say, and that is that the love of Christ shows up in queer spaces, and that's something that many, many people recognize and have named on this show. And I just want to say that because it's something I've experienced as well, and it really is beautiful to be in a bar on a Friday night, literally just surrounded by love
Yeah.
and joy and good wishes and people wanting you to thrive and be well. And that's not something that we get generally in this world, and it's not something that we as queer individuals get generally. So it is
Yeah.
wonderful that even if the church isn't creating that space for us, we have found ways to create that space for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing that has occurred to me recently as I've been going about my queer life is I remember as an evangelical, when you're in that world, you really stay in that world. And so whenever you go to a new city, like you know what churches to go to, and you go there and you immediately feel like you fit in because everybody has the same style, the same theology, the same beliefs. I've just recognized more and more recently that that is so true of the queer community for folks. Once you're out and integrated into whatever corner of the queer community that you're a part of, you can go anywhere in the world and know that there are spaces that will be this healing, accepting, celebratory space. And it, again, just as a mirror of what I experienced in conservative Christianity, the queer community exists in that same way. And as you said, it's just as spiritually nourishing.
Yeah, that's a good acknowledgement there. Ben, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think what you just said, Brandon, brings us to kind of the second part of what we're sort of exploring with this podcast, which is the sort of idea or experience of telling people in the queer community that you are a Christian or that even that you're
Mm.
religious. And I wonder what in interacting with folks like you just said, without that pretense that might be up in a religious space or even in a religiously academic space. What have you experienced when talking to people about being a Christian, being a pastor, being someone studying for a doctorate in New Testament? I mean,
Yeah.
in my experience as a pastor, particularly on dates, I will say, it's like, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, I run a religious nonprofit and I'm a pastor. And it's like saying I am, a creeper who's going to stalk you. I'm just telling you up front. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the kind of the reaction I get. So I'm wondering what has been your experience of that. I would say particularly as a pastor, but also as someone who works in a decidedly religious space.
Yeah. Yeah. I write a lot about this in my new book, Queer and Christian, because like it is such a wide variety of experiences that we have. Sometimes, like some of my closest friends here in New York City, where I live, are not religious, but they really appreciate the fact that I'm doing the work that I do and live in this space. And they see the benefit of, like, for queer people that want to be religious, it's good that a space like that exists. And that's the most positive kind of experience you can have. But as you said, I've often, be it on dating apps or just out in public, come across people that, because of their own trauma and because of their own biases, about largely based in how Christianity has had a disposition against the LGBT community, they
Yeah, they're
automatically
not wrong.
associate. Yeah, they're not, and they associate me when they hear pastor or Christian as either deeply repressed and confused and somebody that needs help, or somebody that's actively hurting and probably in the closet and probably being deceptive to my church and oftentimes there's not a lot of time given to us to explain. I write in the book, there's this chapter of a Hinge conversation I had where the guy literally was like, you're a pastor? And I said, yes, but I'm a progressive, inclusive, sex positive, liberal pastor. And he said, I have no time for that. I don't want to hear that. I don't think that's true, and literally blocked me. So that's a very real thing. And I don't blame the queer community for that. Again, that's our responsibility. Like, we who are pastors have chosen to take on this mantle and represent this community that has hurt our queer community. And it doesn't make it easy emotionally. I definitely have spent a lot of time in therapy being like, how in the hell do I deal with this? But it also gives me more compassion for just how much religious trauma exists in the queer community. Um, the other side of it that I will mention, because I hear this often, is that there is almost a fetishization. I can't say that word. You know what I mean? A fetishizing of Christianity, pastoral stuff. Even as you were talking about the TV show, like this idea of a religious queer person. A lot of people are just fascinated by it. I don't even mean sexually. I just mean like people are like, what is this? This is exotic. This is rare. Um, and a lot of times in those spaces, um, there's real opportunity to have some generative conversation and to actually bring people who might be open and curious into a process where they might find spiritual healing as they come and explore what a queer church looks like, or come to a book group or Bible study I'm hosting. So it's a wide range of experiences out there, not always easy. And there definitely is a reality that queer people have to come out as Christian. And that's not an easy process in our world today.
And I think you're hitting on something that I always think about, which is both the fact that there are times where I would much rather just be like, let's not talk. Like I'm the ED of a nonprofit. Let's just leave it there.
Yeah.
Or I might work with a church, but let's not talk about being a pastor. But the flip side of that is a large part of what compels me to do the work that I do, and I would assume you might agree with this, is my experiences with non-affirming anti-queer clergy in my past and wanting to be someone different, wanting to preach as someone who's openly queer, or wanting to minister as someone who's openly queer, and say to people, particularly younger folks, hey, this isn't the experience that you're going to have with all clergy.
Yeah.
So that balancing act, I find it fascinating academically, but I also find it, like you said, so emotionally draining, perhaps.
Yeah.
And something I definitely share with you in talking with my therapist often about.
Yeah. Yeah. Dating is the hardest side of that, I would say. But I think about the last story at the very end of my book. I conclude with, like, 6 months ago, I was at a bar with my friend here in New York, and the bartender asked, what do you do? And like you, sometimes I just say, I run a small nonprofit. Because it's not to be deceptive. It is about like wanting to keep people feeling like they're in a safe space. And sometimes injecting religion or saying I'm a religious leader makes the whole thing not safe. But this person said, I did tell him I was a pastor, and he said, oh, I'm a pastor's kid, and I feel so conflicted about my faith. And it blossomed into this lovely relationship where we met for coffee and were able to like really build a bridge of healing for him. So again, like, there is a blessing to being a queer Christian in the queer community. But I also think we all just have to be mindful that even if you're not a clergy member, if you're just a Christian, you still carry the weight of this religion and tradition, and be willing to own that and do the work to show people what a real Christian could look like.
Amen.
I really appreciate this conversation. Yes, amen. And I appreciate this conversation because I am an old married lady. I've been married for 15 years. And so the question of how this comes up in a dating context just really is, kind of foreign to me. But I will say that I think it's something that comes up, especially as a Black woman in the Black experience. I think that Black church experiences are something that we do talk about when dating, though, because they are so formative in the Black experience, and whether you're religious or not. Now, that question about what role does faith play in your world today, that's a little bit more difficult of a conversation, but that past shared religious history, I think, is a little bit easier when dating. And again, I'm I've been married for 15 years. I'm talking about the distant past there. Um, but Brandan, I want to talk about your PhD that you are pursuing in New Testament. Why New Testament? What led you to want to do a PhD in that? And is there any relation there to your queer identity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I kind of accidentally ended up in a PhD program. To be honest, my trajectory towards it came from the fact that I didn't want to do a 4-year Master's of Divinity degree. So I did a 2.5-year Master's of Theological Studies degree. And while I was in that program, they said, this is supposed to lead to a PhD. That's why we do these programs. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I should think about that. But really, um, I've loved on TikTok and in churches getting to discuss theology and watch that and see that there's such a deep hunger today among young people and old people alike, religious and non-religious, to talk about biblical history, biblical theology. It's been said recently that the Bible's actually having like a comeback in American public life, for better and for worse. More Bibles are being sold this year than have been in like the past 50 years. So I started like seeing this, and as a Bible nerd, I was like, it would be very cool as a queer person to get a PhD in biblical studies so that I can speak with some authority to these topics and also help democratize this information that I'm privileged to learn in the ivory tower, but most people will never get the chance to go and study. And that's really my mission under my mission these days, is to take all of this knowledge that I've gotten over the past decade and $100,000 of student loans and set it free on the internet, because that's how we undermine Christian nationalism. That's how we undermine non-affirming theology, by presenting better theology and the real knowledge that has existed for like 50 years. Most biblical scholars have been united on the fact that the Bible doesn't condemn queer people. And yet the church widely has not gotten that memo. And so it just feels like there's a real opportunity to help be a bridge to share that information. And also, the last thing I'll say is most of the non-affirming scholars in the world and most of the non-affirming pastors have PhDs in the Bible. And part of me was like, I want to stick it to them. Like, there were not a lot of queer Christians that were studying for this level to go toe to toe with them and have that kind of credibility. And I don't necessarily think having a PhD gives you more authority or credibility, but in those spaces, it actually does. And it feels like it at least gives me a little bit of an ability to rattle their cages a little bit.
As my grandmother would say, tell the truth and shame the devil.
Yeah.
And so I really love that. I love that democratization of the information that, from what you're saying, people want. I'm hoping that people are reading the Bibles that they're buying. Just buying the
Yeah.
Bible won't get that knowledge into you. And so that's what I think. And it's amazing that you're taking that information, and then it sounds like, and I don't watch TikTok. I'm just going to be very honest with you, Brandan.
Yeah.
It is my attention span. I need at least 15 minutes. I need a deep dive. And so changing topics every 30 to 60 seconds just doesn't work with my brain. I'm old. But the idea that you can break down nuggets via TikTok and kind of feed this information out there is pretty interesting to me. But how do you do it? It's so complicated. It's so nothing in the Bible is simple, because you have to read it in context. You have to read it in social and political context. You have to have some familiarity with Judaism and what was going on in that world and all those different things. So how do you take these what can be very complicated theological ideas and break them down so that people can digest them, which I think is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, that's a great question and exactly right. And to be very honest, I mean, what I've learned over the past, I think I've been on TikTok now for almost 6 years, is that you've got to get the soundbite and then use that as a funnel to have deeper conversations. And so, what I've done, like at my TikTok, I will just say something that I know sounds controversial to conservative Christians, but is true theologically. For instance, the Bible, there's not a single verse in the Bible that condemns sex outside of marriage. That's something that when most people hear that soundbite, they're like, that's not right, because they've been taught in church their whole life that the Bible clearly condemns that. But the actual truth is there's no verse in the Bible that condemns same-sex marriage. And then almost monthly, I host these Zoom webinars or Bible studies, and 50 to 500, depending on the year and month, would show up to these webinars where we would spend an hour and a half together doing a deep dive. And it's part of why I also write books, so that it's like, if you're intrigued by that 1 minute kind of out of context provocative theological statement, here are some resources, whether it's my own books or other accessible resources that are out there. So I think that's what most of us on TikTok are actually doing, is trying to provoke a conversation. And then, if we're doing it pastorally, lead people away from the app into books, into their own local churches, into Zoom groups and webinars and things like that. And it's kind of what Love Boldly is doing as well. It's using social media to draw people into the good work that you all create and to help people go deeper. So you're right, TikTok is not great at least for me, doing deep dives. People like Dan McClellan, a Bible scholar, has figured out how to do it very well in 3 minutes and inform people very well. But I don't have that skill set.
But I've heard amazing things about your TikTok. I do also want to say that, Brandan. Ben has told me amazing things about your TikTok. I've heard amazing things, seen it on the internet. So no doubt that you are definitely able to bridge that divide and get those folks in. And then, just as my final question, and then I'll let Ben jump in, is what's it like being a pastor? Like, what is it? I just want to hear from you. I mean, of course, I know a gay pastor. I know Ben, but I want to hear from you. What's it like being a pastor? You are in New York City, so it is a pretty different environment than we have here in the Midwest. And in any challenges or any joys that you want to highlight about what it's, your experience of being a gay pastor?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a blessing and a curse, right? It's the thing that I felt called to do since I was 12. And so I am grateful every day to wake up here at 33 and be like, wow, I'm doing the thing. Um, but I also, to be very honest, the moral weight and the theological certainty that so many people expect pastors to carry is hard. And I've worked really hard in my progressive Christian churches that I've served to right up front say, I am not your moral example. I do not have all of the answers. My job is to be here to cultivate a community where we can figure this stuff out together. But people still project what they expect a religious leader to be onto you, regardless of what you say. And that is a hard weight to carry, because the truth is, I'm figuring all of this out. I've only been out for 8 years, so I'm still figuring out and living through my second adolescence, and trying to encourage congregations to have space for me to be able to do that, while also recognizing that I have chosen a career that does require me to be a leader. It's a difficult tension. But I am finding that as I'm getting older and doing this for more and more years, I'm coming up on, I think, my almost 9th year of doing pastoral ministry, that it is getting easier. And I will say, in New York, I am bivocational. So my previous church in San Diego, I was a full-time pastor there, and that was a very different experience than what I have now, which is 20 hours a week I'm serving this community, which is lovely, but it also gives me space to do the other things I love to do outside of it. And my community understands that I'm not fully pastor all the time, and that feels like, one, the way of the future for many progressive Christian churches that are just not going to be the big churches they used to be. But also, I've just really appreciated the spaciousness I've had to be able to lean into ministry and yet have that contained in a bucket, where then I can go do other things. And I work a full-time job outside of the church that has me doing all different work. So it's a very interesting space to be in.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing both the struggle and the joy there. I love when people are able to see both sides of that. Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Any final questions, Ben?
There are, as Brandan well knows, there are quite a bit that I could comment on and ask about there, particularly sharing with Brandan being a bivocational pastor. But I think I like where this part of the conversation ended. So I'd almost encourage us to go ahead on to the query of the day, and see what comes up there.
Absolutely. So today's query of the day, we're going to kind of reference back to where we started the episode, and that is with queer representation in TV shows. One of the things I do like about mid-century modern is that there is an ex-Mormon, a person for whom faith has played a really big role in his life, and that's not shied away from. It's talked about as part of that character. So my question for Ben and for Brandan and for all of you is there a queer character that you have enjoyed? Is there a representation of queer identity on TV that you have enjoyed seeing, or that you thought was maybe not perfect? None of us is perfect, and none of these representations is going to be perfect, but maybe someone that you related to, someone that you thought told a story that wasn't being told, or presented a side of queer life that people don't often talk about or recognize or acknowledge. Brandan or Ben, either one of you want to go?
I can start.
Yeah.
And one that comes to mind pretty well. Unfortunately, I can't remember the character's name, and I'm not even sure I'm going to get the show right, which is terrible of me. But there's a show, I think it was called Night Shift. It was about ER physicians working at a busy ER, I think in San Antonio. And most of these folks were former military doctors or former military service members. And there was one doctor who I will totally admit that I had a massive crush on the actor and on the character for that reason. But he was this kind of bulky former Army medic, someone who did not come across as being anything less than a very macho straight guy. But I think in the end of the first season, beginning of the second, the show kind of reveals that he is gay, and then positions him as not only being out but still being a very masculine individual. And how just because you're gay doesn't mean you're more feminine or more anything other than who you are. But it also portrays him in his relationship with another equally kind of macho, manly man sort of character who is struggling to come out. And I really appreciate those portrayals of particularly queer men, where it's not, hey, if you're a queer man, you are obviously a very skinny, very feminine, whatever else. That there are other that there are other personas, that there are other ways of being queer, at least for men, that aren't just kind of a basic stereotype. And I always found that, even though I didn't necessarily identify completely with that character, I nevertheless found him to be someone that was much closer to how I think about myself than what has been typically portrayed.
Yeah, I love that. And what's coming up for me is there have been so many great portrayals of both queer faith and that struggle and conversion therapy over the past few years. But one of my favorite movies, mainly because, to copy Ben, I have a crush continually on Troye Sivan, is Boy Erased, which is this beautiful film that shows the real struggle of a conservative Christian family with their gay child that they end up sending off to conversion therapy. And what I love about it is when I show it to my queer siblings that have never kind of been a part of this world, they see how absurd that this conservative Christian heal, pray away the gay kind of thing actually is. But it actually portrays it very accurately, like what these camps look like and what these crazy attempts to heal people look like, and exposes the real dark underbelly of Christian theology that perpetuates exclusion and harm to queer people. But then it also ends with the journey of the young man kind of walking away from faith and trying to wrestle with his place in the world and in his family. And that's an experience that I actually haven't seen all that represented, that kind of deconstruction and healing journey. And so that movie is one that I've watched numerous times. I've recommended it to church groups many times because it's just so real. It shows the fullness of the story and struggle that many queer Christians have gone through. And Troye Sivan is great.
And then I have three because I love queer characters. So I have one from my childhood, from my teenage years, and that is Enrique Vasquez, I believe, from My So-Called Life. Oh my gosh, like little 14 to 16-year-old Bon loved him and everything. And I just wanted to be his best friend. I was so jealous of Claire Danes. But in my adulthood, I think folks are not going to be surprised when I say Omar Little and Kima Greggs from The Wire. And I think that that was just one of those moments when I was watching The Wire and realized that Omar was gay. I think I screamed, if I'm recalling correctly, when I was watching the episode, because it was such a break from what we see, either a thug, how a black thug, quote unquote, is portrayed on TV, and then how gay men are portrayed on TV. And the fact that they didn't just tell us that Omar was gay, but they showed us, and they showed him being affectionate and having boyfriends and caring for people, for others that he was in relationships with. And that was incredible, because we were seeing a black man who was a criminal and very much didn't care about people and was very ruthless, but also had this other side to him in which he very much cared about the men that he was in relationships with. And then Kima Greggs was just hot because she's very attractive and was a police officer, and that's super hot. So kind of problematic, also super hot. That's okay. We can be both. All right. So thank you for answering Queerie of the Day. So much out there. So if you are listening, please, please, please tell us who your favorite characters are from TV, and let us know so that we can get into those as well. And now we're going to move into our moment in queer Christian history. This is when Ben tells us a moment from Christian history that involves a queer person, so that we are reminded that not only have we always been here, we've always been here in the church.
So today I want to share a little bit about someone that I know that Brandan knows as well, and someone we probably all, or many of us who are in this kind of queer Christian space, have at least heard about. But we were talking about representation. And when I was coming out, particularly as a first year in college at this small little Episcopalian college in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee, one of the people who really represented what I wanted to be as a queer person, who had kind of figured out how to do it in the church, was Gene Robinson. The Right Reverend Gene Robinson is now the retired bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire. Many folks will remember him as the first active out queer bishop, at least male bishop, probably anywhere in the world, definitely in the Episcopal Church and in American Christianity. Gene had actually gone to the same college that I was attending at the time. I had graduated quite a few years before me, but my freshman year, he came to campus to speak. And I was so totally in the closet. I sat in one of the back rows, and every time people clapped or gave him a standing ovation, I just sat there and crossed my arms or something and pretended like I was just there because, this awful, horrible sinner was on campus. Fast forward, I mean, I clearly knew I was gay, but I was nowhere close to wanting to admit that yet. And fast forward a year, and when I did come out, someone put me in contact with Gene, and Gene was just completely lovely, as he always is, about not necessarily forming a mentorship or a friendship or something, but nevertheless answering some of my questions, giving me some good encouragement, pointing me not just to books to read, but actually to other human beings who we had similar connections with, particularly through Swanee. And just, again, really representing for me in a lot of ways, not only that, yes, you could be queer and be Christian, but that you could also be queer, Christian, and a pastor, and maybe a bishop if you wanted to be. But you could do these things that my very Roman Catholic upbringing had told me you could only do if you were very much in the closet and very much not talking about this. So that was very powerful to me. So I just again wanted to represent Jean, who is continuing to do some amazing work, even probably even now doing more radical work in retirement, quote unquote, than he did when he was an active bishop.
Mm.
Thank you, Ben. Isn't it amazing what these visible examples of possibility, what they can do in our lives, the impact that they can have on individuals and really spark something in each of us. So thank you for sharing that. Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of Coming Out Christian. I want to thank our amazing guest, Reverend Brandan Robertson. Thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything that you would like to promote or share, or any place that our listeners can find you if they want to hear more?
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. And just to say, I'm celebrating the launch of my book, which will have been out for a month now, called Queer and Christian, Reclaiming the Bible, Our Faith, and Our Place at the Table, with a foreword by Bishop Jean Robinson, funny enough. And this summer, I'm going to be on a 40-plus city tour across the country speaking about this book. And so if you're listening to this, in July through October, I will be in cities across the country and probably in a city near you. So learn more about the book and the tour at queerchristian.org, and I hope to see you all out there.
Amazing. Good luck on that book tour. So no matter where you are, it sounds like Brandan's going to be coming to a city near you. So please get out there, see Brandan, get into his books. There's so many to choose from. Get into this latest book. And Ben, thank you for being here. It was wonderful, as always, to see you. And I hope everyone has an amazing end to their Pride Month. And we will see you next time on another episode of Coming Out Christian.
Thank you for listening to Coming Out Christian with Siobhan Boyd Nelson and me, Ben Hillscamp. Do you want to see content like this continue to be produced? Then please support Love Boldly with a donation and consider becoming a monthly donor. You can donate online at www.loveboldly.net/donate. Join us next time as we continue to engage with people who proudly say that we're here, we're queer, and we love the Lord. And we're not going anywhere.